This goal is what kickstarted the closest thing we've gotten to a dynasty in a very long time. Throughout the first half of the 2010s, the Chicago Blackhawks would win 3 Stanley Cups in 5 years, dominating teams and scoring at will. And one of their superstars was none other than Patrick Kane. Kane was a star in the early 2010s, and he and his Hawks entered Game 6 of the Stanley Cup Final with a 3-2 series lead. They would also have a 3-2 lead in that game as well, but after a late goal by Scott Hartnell, it tied things up and the game would head to overtime. It took Chicago just 4 minutes to score the dagger, and as much as Kane's goal was significant, it's also extremely confusing, as when looking back and watching it happen again, no one knows where the puck went. The viewers at home, clueless. Flyers goaltender Michael Leighton, clueless. This moment would also bring us one of the greatest pieces of sports media in the last decade, as a Flyers fan in attendance would summarize everyone's reaction.
Oh, I thought it was in. Where's the puck? What happened? They won! What the fuck happened?
The only one who knew was Patrick Kane, and when looking back at the images taken, you can see the puck inside of the net, which was stuck underneath the netting. Doc Emmerich, who was calling that game, sounded just as confused as the rest of us, yet still delivered a great call, one that he would eventually redo during February of 2021. Kane's goal would be one of the most iconic of the decade. Unfortunately, however, this moment will now forever be stained, due to a very serious and terrible scandal involving the organization, but it is still one of the most confusing things to ever occur in a Stanley Cup final. 11 years before, however, another confusing moment would take place, ironically in a Game 6 overtime as well, and I think you know where I'm going with this. I'm also sure you're tired of hearing about this incident, especially if you're a Sabres fan, but nonetheless, here we are. And the reason why this is deemed confusing is that to this day, many argue whether or not the goal should have counted, as when looking back into the official rulebook from the 99 season, it specifically states, quote, unless the puck is in the goal crease area, a player of the attacking side may not stand in the goal crease. Also, numerous goals very similar to Hull's would get called back during the regular season that year as well. So, why? Why didn't the referees even attempt to review the goal? And for that, there may only be one logical explanation, an excuse rather, that being they simply had no idea until the game was over. And here's why that may be the case. Numerous Stars players would mention that they didn't see what happened until after the game was over and during the celebration on the replay. To be fair though, most didn't even care, with Guy Carbonneau stating, quote, what's done is done. If there's a controversy, that's too bad. I'm sorry about it, and I'm sure they're going to be upset, but for me, the season is over, the cup is on our side, and that's all that matters. Buffalo obviously didn't take too kindly to this, with defenseman Jay McKee stating, if they're going to beat us, at least beat us with a real goal. Usually with these types of plays, a review would seem evident, but that wasn't the case, and Sabres coach Lindy Ruff would state that he felt Bettman turned his back on him. The whole situation is a complete mess, with both sides having reasonable arguments, but let me know your thoughts. Was it a good goal? Well, while we're on the topic of not seeing what happened, now's the perfect time to mention the 2011 Western Conference Final. Did you see the puck? No, me neither at first. And when watching the replays on the broadcast, it doesn't really help at all. Canucks Kevin Bieksa sent his team to the Stanley Cup Final in one of the most confusing ways imaginable, scoring a goal that no one, only he, could see. And the funniest part about it is that they shouldn't even be in that moment right now, as the Sharks had a lead until 13 seconds remained in the third, as a Ryan Kessler goal would force the game to overtime, and in double OT, Bieksa pulled off the goal. When watching the replay, it was determined that the puck actually actually went off the stanchion in the glass along the sideboards, and when it bounced out to the blue line, there was nothing but confused faces and a Kevin Bieksa who hit the puck dead on. Marleau was upset, but understood it was a bad bounce, and Bieksa later admitted that it was simply a lucky shot. There's nothing else really to mention besides the fact that it was just an absurd, lucky, and confusing play. Vancouver would ultimately lose in the Stanley Cup Final in Game 7, and the rest is history. But that 2011 run was special in itself. Now, let's shy away from asking where and start asking why. And there's no better way to start than by going back to the 1998 Winter Olympics. That year, Canada looked stacked, as this would be the first year where NHLers were allowed to participate in the Olympic Games. And Team Canada's lineup was loaded with Hall of Famers up and down. Guys such as Gretzky, Pronger, Patrick Waugh, and the great leader Mark Messier. Oh, wait. He wasn't included. Why? Well, GM Bob Clark decided that the dependable defensive forward Rob Zollner would be the better pick. Yeah, this move was controversial, but wasn't the most controversial of them all. For instance, most would assume that Gretzky would be the obvious choice for team captain. Right? Nope. Instead, Clark named Eric Lindros the captain, which is kinda ironic considering years later,
He shouldn't be captain.
but the most controversial move would be the one made by head coach Mark Crawford once the Olympics began. Team Canada was set to face off against Team Czechoslovakia, who, unlike Canada, didn't have as much star power. They were mostly heavily reliant on their goaltender Dominik Hasek, whose goaltending style, although completely unorthodox, was working exceptionally well for him as he dominated that year's Olympic Games. And the Czechs weren't scared of utilizing him to their advantage, and they showed this in their game against Canada, as when a chance to play in the gold medal game was on the line, they didn't back down. They would hold the lead up until the third, where a goal by Trevor Linden would force overtime, and once both teams remained deadlocked, they entered the shootout. Going back to what I previously just said, if you have an asset, utilize it. The Czechs weren't scared of going to a shootout because they can utilize Hasek. In fact, some members of Team Canada believe the Czechs were purposely trying to go to the shootout. Well, Coach Crawford revealed a shootout list, and to everyone's surprise, Wayne Gretzky was not included. Theo Fleury would go first and miss the net, and Rob Reichel would respond with a goal. As the list got shorter, Canada didn't score, and eventually, it was all down to Brendan Shanahan, who missed the net. The Czechs would advance to the gold medal game and would eventually win it all, and Hasek would be named the MVP of that year's tournament. The decision to bench Gretzky is confusing, but there's two things to point out. One is that throughout the entire Olympics, Gretzky remained scoreless, but still registered 4 assists, and one of the very few things Wayne was bad at was scoring on the breakaway, and Crawford still stands by his decision, stating, quote, "Wayne would have loved the opportunity to shoot, and I never feel poorly about the choices I made." That's all well and good, but some have to wonder whether or not Gretzky's impact would have changed the outcome at all, as maybe he could have tied it at 1 and changed history, but thanks to Mark Crawford, we'll never really know. All we do know is that Hasek must have been smiling ear to ear, watching as Team Canada kept a great one on the bench. Finally, we saved the best for last, as this topic was so intriguing that I knew as soon as it was discovered, I had to cover it. The story actually begins with me, and while looking for some final ideas to add to today's video, I decided to go on r/hockey to get some potential ideas. Little did I know that the post I posted would blow up with over 100 people giving their insight, but while looking through the responses, I came across a post titled, "Notice anything odd about this box score?" which instantly got my attention, and when clicking on it, all seemed normal until I scrolled down. The score showed a game between the Edmonton Oilers and the Vancouver Canucks from April of 2000, in which the Oilers won the game 5-4 in overtime. By looking at the period-by-period breakdown, everything is as it should, but when looking at who scored the overtime winner, it shows this. Yeah, Edmonton scored on an empty net in overtime to win the game. Which brings up the question, why in the world would anyone do that? When trying to find highlights of the game itself, there was nothing to be found. So, being curious, I asked why, which eventually began an investigation into the April 17th game. The initial thought by many would be that maybe Vancouver pulled the net to gain an extra attacker thanks to an Edmonton delayed penalty, and somehow they just put it in their own net. But that wouldn't make sense at all, as from what was eventually found out, this game was a must-win for Vancouver, as a trip to the postseason was on the line. This is where a fellow Flames fan by the user of Pyro5050 comes in. I asked if I could use his comments in the video, and he agreed, so here we are. His messages are pretty long, so I'll summarize them while showcasing his comments. He starts by stating, quote, "That was the second to last game of the season, and at the moment, Edmonton had 84 points and Vancouver had 83. Also playing that day was the San Jose Sharks, who had 85 points. For Vancouver to make it, they would have to beat Edmonton and hope that the Sharks lose, as their final game of the season would be against San Jose. If Vancouver were to win out, they would have 87 points and could make it in. Well, that night, San Jose had a 1-goal lead in the third against Arizona, and Vancouver needed Arizona to beat the Sharks, while also having to beat Edmonton. So with that all being said, it makes zero sense to assume that they would purposely try to lose or purposely put it in their own net. So now that we know the backstory of the game and that they lost in overtime, at least they still got a point, right? Well, no, as under the final score, it states, no point given due to Vancouver pulling their net in overtime. How does that make any sense? Well, back to Pyro, who brought up section 10, rule 84.2, that states, a team shall be allowed to pull its goalkeeper in favor of an additional skater in the overtime period. However, should the team lose during the time the goalkeeper was removed, it would forfeit the automatic point gained in the tie at the end of regulation play, except if the goalkeeper got removed at the call of a delayed penalty. Knowing that, we can now assume that they pulled their goaltender to simply gain an extra attacker, most likely knowing the risk of losing a point. But again, why? Well, Pyro again mentioned that, quote, back then, the odds of a team scoring on an empty net was 5 out of 6 times, and on average, it was estimated that it would take a team 2 minutes and 25 seconds to score a goal with an empty net. So, while gathering all this information, it's most likely safe to assume that the Vancouver Canucks pulled the net in desperate need of 2 points, and ultimately would risk it all, failing in the process and eliminating themselves from contention. But even if they got the point, Arizona couldn't come back that night, and San Jose would reach 87 points, eliminating them either way. Now, this could all be put to rest with a simple comment from someone who watched it, or from someone who can find the footage. But for a brief moment, I felt as if we found something super interesting and extremely confusing, something to perfectly top off today's video. And as we've seen in today's video, the Vancouver Canucks are no strangers to confusing moments.
Hits it hits the stanchion, comes right back, but watch Edler. Nobody's looking at where it is. A knuckle puck that goes right inside the post.